The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed in the Our Culture, Our Stories podcast are those of the individual hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect the official policies or positions of the NAACP or any affiliated organizations.
Film is one of those few, ways that we can connect with people as people and not always bring all of our assumptions and stereotypes. We can combat those stereotypes by pointing out how much we have in common. And so, I think about opportunities like that where they're available and how we can use film to bring us together rather than just, separate us. There's a lot already separating us.
Let's welcome Don Porter to Our Cultures, Our Stories, a NAACP podcast series. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be with you.
It is great to have you with us. We are looking forward to this conversation. And one thing I didn't mention in that is you're a relative of Paul Robeson. Wow. Just
I am.
that's mind-boggling.
Growing up, so Paul Robeson is my grandmother, Marion Robeson Liggins. He's my grandmother's uncle. So Uncle Paul, as she would call him, is my great grandfather's little brother. But they were very, very close. And my great grandfather was a pastor at Mother AME Zion Church in Harlem, which is actually just 2 blocks away from where I live now. And Uncle Paul used to address the church. He would sing, sometimes he would speak. He really used the church as a respite. He was such a public figure. He was so outspoken politically. In later years got attacked, the McCarthy hearings, they took his passport. So the church was a home for him, and his older brother provided that home. And so it's a really important part of my family's legacy. I grew up hearing those stories about my family and about, how they were targeted, but also how they resisted. And I think even as a young child, that made a big, big impression on me. I was really proud to be related to somebody so brave.
I was wondering how that has had an impact on the decisions that you've made in your career, because you were a practicing lawyer turned documentarian, turned filmmaker, director. How has that connection formulated you?
The connection to the Robeson family was always, I think it's a really formative inspiration for me as a young person. Something people don't remember about Uncle Paul is that he was a lawyer. So he graduated from Rutgers, then Columbia Law School. That was his first career. And then he segued into the arts, and from the arts into politics. And so the legacy of the Robesons, and then my great-grandfather, Ben Robeson, and his father, William Drew Robeson, who was also a pastor, their history is starting churches and pulling away from the segregated Methodist Church. So the African Methodist Episcopal Church is a response to segregation, even in houses of worship. The Robeson lineage is you stand up, you point out oppression, you resist it, but you also have pride in your accomplishments. And I think that was something that my family always emphasized, is how accomplished. And I think about that a lot, like how accomplished these people were in like the deepest times of segregation. Uncle Paul was performing on Broadway in Othello, but could not sit in the audience. And my grandmother could not go see him on Broadway because we were Black. So, you know, that's been a really formative part of my coming up.
How important is the NAACP to the struggle and everything that you just talked about that your Uncle Paul Robeson endured?
You know, literally since the time I was a child, you would hear about the NAACP's efforts. And I am also a lawyer. So the legacy of, you know, the NAACP, both in arts and culture and representation, but also, of course, in the law. I mean, Thurgood Marshall's history, you know, Justice Marshall was just a lion for so many people, but definitely for me. And I think what the NAACP has always done that is so important um, is to remind us as a people how accomplished we are, and to provide this space where we can celebrate those accomplishments without apology,
Mm.
without feeling like imposters or you know, we're either in the dominant culture, we are DEI, or, you know, or less than. And here at the NAACP, we are just ourselves. So you are
Oh. Mm.
recognized for your contributions based on the work and the merit and the reception. Not everything's going to be amazing, but it's very significant for us as the NAACP community, which is what we are, for us to remember where we came from and look out and see so many of us accomplishing. Because no one wants to be the only, you know, that's not fun.
We can just be ourselves. I think that's the quote of the day. Yeah, love that. And just taking it a step further, do you recall any fond or any significant moments as it relates to filmmaking when it comes to the NAACP Image Awards? Anything that comes to mind?
I mean, that the NAACP Image Awards show is just so much fun. Like from the beginning, seeing what everybody's wearing, seeing who's going to show up, the performances, you know, in the film Luther that we do. We have a whole segment dedicated to Dionne Warwick and to Luther Vandross performing at the Image Awards when she was honored. And so it's such a, you know, dreamy thing for me to be speaking with you and to be speaking about this show that is such an iconic part of culture and history. Um, you know, everybody wants to go to the NAACP Image Awards. That's definitely the hottest ticket in town.
You mentioned it. You brought it up. I thought maybe we get to a little later, but since you brought it up, you mentioned a guy by the name of Luther. Tell us about that and how it all came to be, and whatever it is you like to share about the iconic Luther Vandross.
Well, the way that the Luther Vandross film came about is I had a meeting with some executives from Sony. And Sony has, in recent years, been kind of exploiting their catalog and, you know, taking a look and seeing who of the many Sony artists, you know, could take the documentary treatment. And so, you know, this person listed a number of different artists. And when he got to Luther, I thought, wait a minute, there's no Luther Vandross documentary? Like, how could that even be? I mean, Luther is the soundtrack to everyone's, you know, love and life for so many years. And so they allowed me to do some research and to kind of see what elements they had in their vaults. The Luther Vandross estate opened up, you know, their archives. And once we started digging around in there and saw all the things that we had to work with in terms of storytelling. So there were all these interviews that Luther had done over the years. lyrics from his songs, rehearsal footage, just all these gems. And it really allowed me to say, we could tell this story and really bring him back to be part of the storytelling of his own life. And so that was really exciting to me as a filmmaker, is I could string together people from Broadway to Wall Street talking about how amazing Luther Vandross is. But I didn't want to just do that. I wanted him to really. Luther has been telling the story of his life, his whole life. We just put it all together so you could see what his journey was. And it is such um, an important journey of African American culture. Luther, even as a young man, pointed out the African American women in particular who were so influential to him: Aretha, Dion, Diana Ross. These were the people that he looked up to, and he wanted to have as big an impact on his audience as these women had in his life. And so that's really, where we started, with a very young Luther, and we have some really funny and fun moments. Luther Vandross was everywhere, and when I think about it, isn't that so often the story of Black artists and entertainers and scientists and politicians? Is we may not be getting noticed, but we are certainly influential.
Absolutely. I hosted an R&B music festival a couple of months ago, 6,000 people. I had the DJ play Never Too Much, which is a part of the title, the Luther Vandross Never Too Much story, right? And I had him cut the music, and 6,000 people knew every single word to that song, and they sung it a cappella. You're right. It was incredible. He was everywhere. Some of your other projects, I see Lady Bird behind you.
Here she is.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, there she is. We see her. Uh, what are some of your what are some of the projects that you've worked on and afterward you just thought, oh my goodness, I was able to get this done? Are there any projects that you look back on, and maybe Luther is one of them, but any of them that you just look back on and you wondered, there were times where you wondered whether or not it was going to get done for whatever
Oh, that
reason?
Yeah, that happens all the time. I mean, it happens more often than not. Luther was actually one of the projects that came together really seamlessly. But a number of films, filmmaking is challenging. So when I think about the film I made about Congressman John Lewis,
Mm,
we were following him for what turned out to be the last years of his life, and it wasn't hard to make that film. What was hard is that he passed away before our big broadcast. I always envisioned that, you get to travel with John Lewis, and he was so much fun to travel with. Mr. Lewis, he would never turn down anybody who wanted to come up and say hello to him, which is everybody. Everybody wanted to come say hello to him. So it was, it became such a recurring thing that would happen, that we started to build in extra time in the airport. And then we made a sequence of it, because people would just come and say, can I shake your hand? Can I shake your hand? Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. And he never took that for granted. He understood what he meant to people, and I think that was really important, for me, but also for our crew to see. There are so many people that value John Lewis's contributions to our country, and don't we miss his voice today? He's able to stand on principle, but also to reach across the aisle. He was a mentor, a friend, just a spectacular human being. You know how they always say, don't meet your heroes. Well, this hero
yeah,
defied that advice, because
yeah.
he exceeded my expectations about what someone who has done so much and suffered so much. Um, John Lewis is a very happy, person, and he would always say, do not become bitter or hostile. When you become bitter, that is when you lose your humanity. That is when your enemies win. And I think about that a lot is, it's really don't let them steal your joy. John Lewis would say there's always something you can do. So, but when I think about projects that, almost didn't happen, I made a film about abortion providers in the Deep South. And that was really difficult because, what a lot of people didn't realize was African American women and poor women, those are not always the same thing, but sometimes they overlap all too often. All too often, it's poor women who look like us. And these are women who were not getting health care, who were not getting. The abortion story is also a poverty story. I interviewed so many women who wanted to keep their children, but thought it would not be responsible to bring another child in that they could not afford to take care of. And that is the most heartbreaking thing. Anti-choice people will say, "Oh, you're aborting black babies." Well, these mothers wanted their children, but they wanted to raise their children healthy and happy and cared for. And so to them, the choice was, I'd rather not bring a child into the world that I cannot take care of. So that was a hard film because we couldn't get funding. So we were constantly raising money while we were trying to stay in these clinics. That was really hard. We just did the new installment of Eyes on the Prize, the seminal civil rights story. That was challenging because it's 6 hours and it's archival footage and there's a lot of it. But that series is so important. That's one of the first documentaries I ever saw. And so there's Eyes on the Prize 1, there's Eyes on the Prize 2. Some people don't remember there's Eyes on the Prize 2, but there is. Right. So, we have had the honor of doing Eyes on the Prize 3, highlighting the accomplishments of more modern activists who are working to fight injustice. So we kind of pick up where Eyes on the Prize 2 left off, and we move forward to just about the Obama era, because the distinct important thing about Eyes on the Prize is it is a look back. It is saying, how did these struggles, what happened? How did we get to these? So, but the topics that we cover in Eyes 3 from the late 80s to just about 20 years ago, they are still all social issues we're dealing with today. So we deal with environmental racism, book banning, politics, elections, affirmative action. These are all issues we're still dealing with, and activists, from the 1980s forward have been. So we tell that intervening story. It's not what's happening today, but what's happened in that period from 1980 so to like about 2000, just about to when President Barack Obama took office, 2000, a little bit, about 2010 is where we get to.
What does it mean to be recognized and decorated for championing the telling of stories that you just mentioned, which some of them are untold in our history? What does that mean to be recognized for that?
To be recognized for my work, to be honest, it's not something I ever expected. My career, I always thought I was going to be a lawyer and I was going to live out my days, at a law firm. And then I went to work for ABC Television and then ABC News. And what I was seeing were stories about people who look like you and me, but not by people who look like you and me. And I thought, I could do this. I'll just teach myself. If nobody's going to teach me, I didn't go to film school. I'll just teach myself. And I had a lot of help and a lot of, one thing that I felt I was skilled at was bringing together assembling the right teams. You got to get the right teams in place. So I never expected the recognition. It is extremely important because filmmaking is hard. And what's hard is everything about it is hard. It's hard to raise the money. It's hard to find the right place to air your work. It's hard to manage teams. Sometimes it's hard to figure out what's the right story, what's the right approach. But I love it. I love all of these challenges. But I don't take for granted that I'm able to do it as my living. I think I have the best job in the world. I get to talk to incredible people, and I get to ask all the questions I'm curious about of people who are experts. So I'm like, and then you're going to give me a prize? Well, okay, I'll take that. But the other thing it does is recognition really fills you up. And so when you're about to take on the next challenge, you think, okay, you know what? At least I know that somebody's watching, that this work is getting out there. I've had a number of people, particularly young women and particularly young, Black and brown women, Asian women say, because you're doing this, I thought I could do it too. And that's the recognition that means the most to me, because I didn't see a lot of people looking like me who were making films in the director's chair. And that, all parts of filmmaking, all jobs are important, but we do need to have more directors and people who are making the final decisions about how we are portrayed and how our stories are told.
Absolutely. When did you know that this is what you were supposed to be doing with your life? Was there a particular moment? Was there an incident? Was there a conversation?
I think I knew that directing film, particularly documentary film, was what I was supposed to do um, when I was, well, two moments come to mind. One is the very first film festival and conference that I attended. And everyone there was talking about things that I was interested in. I was interested in all of it. I was interested in how you raise the money, how you shoot things, how you script, how you ethics. I was interested in all of it, all of it. And I thought, these are my people. These are my people. Um, and then the second thing was my first film was a film about young public defenders and premiered at Sundance Film Festival. And that was very scary because filmmaking can be very isolating. You're working with your small team and you're just like head down making your film. And then when it comes out and it's on the big screen, I thought, oh boy, everyone else is going to see this too. If I fail, it's going to be so public. But when the film ended, and it was a good response, but this young man stood up and he said, the film was about public defenders. And he said, hi, my name is such and such. I am a public defender. And the audience went crazy clapping for him. And he said, that never happens. And he said, thank you for, I've been trying to explain to my parents what I do and why it's important to me. And this film really is what I'm going to show them to show, why that's important. So, that representation, and these are the people who are fighting to preserve the Constitution. That phrase, you have the right to a lawyer. Well, that's the Sixth Amendment. And the public defenders are providing you the lawyer that you have a right to under the Constitution. So I'm not saying all of them are great, but a lot of them are really, really, really damn good. And we should respect that they are trying to protect our rights. So that was very, very meaningful to me.
How else do you feel your work has made a contribution to the larger societal conversation surrounding Black culture and social justice?
I think much like Luther's story, sometimes the contributions of Black people, those contributions aren't recognized. And so I think I know that my films have contributed to a greater understanding of so many accomplishments of Black people. So from John Lewis, but also, in my series Bobby Kennedy for President, when I pitched it to Netflix, I was like, this is going to be the blackest Bobby Kennedy you've ever seen, because Bobby Kennedy was really influenced by so many Black individuals. John Lewis was one of his early aides in his 20s. John Lewis set up Bobby Kennedy's speech and rally in Indianapolis the day that Dr. King was murdered. And Bobby Kennedy was not going to address the crowd. And a 20-something-year-old John Lewis said, you must speak to them. And Bobby Kennedy listened to him. And Indianapolis did not burn that night. It was one of the only cities without riots. It was also the first time that Bobby Kennedy spoke about his brother JFK's death. And he said to that audience, my brother was killed by a white man. I understand your anger. Such an interesting historical moment that is kind of lost to time. And if John Lewis hadn't been there, I'm not sure that moment would have happened. Bobby Kennedy also invited Marion Wright. She was not Marion Wright Edelman yet. She was Marion Wright. She was also in her 20s. She was doing work in deep Mississippi where people were starving. And Bobby Kennedy invited Marion to testify before his committee when he was a senator. And then she invited him to Mississippi to see people starving. And it's the first time that the United States gave food aid from the Department of Agriculture to American citizens. And that's because of Marion Wright Edelman's testimony and influence on Bobby Kennedy. So Harry Belafonte spoke to us for that series and talked about the influence of so many Black activists on Bobby Kennedy. That is how he became the civil rights hero. That didn't just happen, but he listened to people, and among them are all these prominent Black Americans. So I think that, part of the job of documentarians is to tell the truth. And the truth is, we are just ingrained in the fabric and advances of this country. And so our contributions should be acknowledged and recognized and lifted up.
Some of these questions, you're answering them before I get to them, which is great. I'm wondering, is she looking at what I'm looking at? But you mentioned
I got nothing.
yeah, I know. It's just kind of crazy. It's happened multiple times since we started talking. It's just happening organically.
I think you're well prepared.
Well, thank you. Teamwork makes the dream work. We got a team over here. So you've mentioned the good fight in depth. In what other ways do you use your work to impact activism?
One of the ways that I try and use my work to impact and affect change is really very simple, and it's actually the easiest thing to do, and so it always surprises me when people don't do it. But you need to develop empathy in people. We, as a society, particularly American society, we're very fragmented these days. And so our schools are segregated, our houses of worship are segregated, we are working remotely, so we're not coming into contact with people at work the way that we used to. And that's when you can kind of otherize people. And so one of the things that film does, and that I think about a lot, is how can we show you somebody else's life in a way that speaks to you, and you say, that person is just like me. So I think about, my first film, Gideon's Army. There was a young man accused of a crime, no physical evidence against him. It's eyewitness testimony. We had the opportunity to follow his case and to the lawyer, because we were following the lawyers who were representing him. And, when I was thinking about, well, how am I going to introduce this young man to the audience? Because we're always introduced to people accused of crimes as if they're already guilty. And so, what I did is we started the interview in his home. He's in his regular clothes. He's not in an orange jumpsuit. and we spoke to his mother. And I said, "Tell me about Demontes. What was he like as a baby?" Well, we all know mothers say one of two things: they were a good sleeper or a bad sleeper. They were a good eater or a bad eater. Demontes was a very good baby. And when she says that line, Demontes was a very good baby. Every mother in particular, but every parent knows what that means. You start filling in the blanks, right? Oh, the good baby. The good baby sleeps. The good baby goes to everybody. The good baby eats everything. I don't think there's any bad babies, but there's babies that
Yeah.
are easier, right? Demonte was the easy
Sure.
baby. But what that
Sure.
does is that makes you start to think of him as a baby, as a child that we are supposed to care about and protect. And we do not want this person to go to prison if he's innocent. And so Demontes, who is, dark skinned black boy, pants down below where I would like them, by the end of the movie, people are like, their heart is in their throat because they have connected with him as a person. And film is one of those few, ways that we can connect with people as people and not always bring all of our assumptions and stereotypes. We can combat those stereotypes by pointing out how much we have in common. And so, I think about opportunities like that where they're available and how we can use film to bring us together rather than just, separate us. There's a lot already separating us.
Absolutely. You mentioned the good baby, Demontes. Is that his name, Demontes? He was a good baby. So as you are capturing and documenting the lives of the figures who are perceived as larger than life, there's got to be moments that the reality is that the story may not cast them in the best light. They may not be a good baby. Uh,
That's
how do you navigate between being completely transparent in the depiction versus being reverent of their legacy?
your job as a documentarian is to tell the truth. And not every part of the truth is flattering. But I don't know any one person who has a completely flattering life. I don't. I'm sure you don't, even though I don't know you and you seem very nice.
I don't.
Um,
I don't.
and so I think audiences are, if you contextualize and you're honest about what has happened, you can cover the harder things. And to me, it usually makes you admire the person even more if they've made mistakes and come back from them, or if they've survived difficult things and it didn't derail from all the amazing things that they did. Well, that's life. That's what we teach our children is you're going to fall. It's how and when you get up that we're focused on. It's not the fall. So, John Lewis, who we all regard as an American treasure and hero, he had a really difficult campaign when he was running for the Congress. And, he, against his very good friend, Julian Bond, and he raised some, kind of dark allegations about Julian Bond. And I don't think it was his finest moment. But I think he still had a long, good career. No one thinks any less of Mr. Lewis because he was a scrappy campaigner. For Luther Vandross, he had some very difficult moments in his life. He was driving a car, got in an accident, jumped the divider. A person was killed in that car. So his life has not always been easy. He pled no contest to that driving record. So you kind of have to. I think the key is like what matters. Like my job isn't to bring up every dark thing in your life, but if there's something that's really significant to the story, your job is to tell that as truthfully as you can, and give it the right amount of significance. So. Um, some people are also not only the worst things that have happened to them or that they have done. They are a combination of so many things. And I think when you tell that fuller story, people respect the storytelling even more. So that's kind of how I approach it.
Fantastic answer. How do you determine what the right amount is? You said give it the right amount of, say, attention, or did you say,
Yeah,
yeah?
attention.
How do,
Mhm.
yeah? How do you
You know, when
determine?
you're yeah,
Okay.
when you're the process of putting together a documentary is really long. It usually takes us, a year to 3 years or more. And what I do to prepare is where it's available, you look at archive, you look at interviews, you look at news coverage from the time. So you start to try and think, how important was this? Is it important now, 50 years later, that we're focusing on it? Or was it really important then and we haven't given it enough attention? But to some extent, it's judgment. I think one of the things from being a lawyer, I was a litigator. I think that experience, I use that experience in trying to evaluate. You have to evaluate. Sometimes people don't tell you the truth. What are you going to do if you suspect they're not telling you the truth? And so I have to, I don't just take what people say at face value. We confirm it, we double check it. Sometimes we have to confront them. I had that happen recently in a film where someone had told us something, they'd omitted a very big detail. I went back to
Hmm.
them, I asked for their side of the story. And then you figure out, like, ultimately, I'm responsible for the content of the film. And so I have to feel like if you come asking me about this question, why did you ask that person that question? That I can say, this is why. And I feel like that was the right thing to do, or I didn't do it right. I haven't felt that yet, but but I have to feel that I've done enough work to know that this is as close to the truth as I can tell from the work that me and my teams have put in order to figure that out.
The name of your film company is Trilogy Films. First, how did you come up with the name Trilogy? What's the relevance of the name?
What's the backstory? We came up with the name Trilogy because we always want to do trilogies. We want to do more than one, and I think there's multiple sides to every story. But also because we came up with 57 other names and they were all taken, and so we were like, okay, this one's fine.
Yeah, that was easy.
I don't even remember all the other
How,
names, but it was like, whoa, there's a lot of different companies out there.
obviously, the possibilities in storytelling are endless, but are there any passion projects for you in Trilogy Films? And if so, go ahead. I see you. Go right ahead.
I'm laughing because particularly my younger son, I have two kids, um, and my younger son, when we go places, he'll say, "Do not speak to anyone," because I find people endlessly fascinating. And I guess I'm a little like John Lewis that way. Like, don't turn down a conversation. Um, I'm really fascinated with Ida Wells Barnett. It's an
Mm.
eclectic list: Ida Wells Barnett, Stevie Wonder, um, and Winnie Mandela. And so I'm working on one of those right now, Winnie Mandela. We're working on it's Winnie and Nelson. Everybody's focus is on the Nelson, good person to focus on, but there was also a Winnie. And her story is really remarkable and fascinating. I think, like Lady Bird here, a lot of the women in history do not have their full stories told. And I found a lot of similarities in how these public spouses, particularly when they're female, um, what they have to give up and what they don't get credit for. And I think it's time we work on that.
What kind of other stories would you like to tell that aren't being told, you feel, currently in film? Are there any others you're passionate about Winnie? Going to get that one done. What else is there for you that you think you story you'd like to tell that you may not be currently working on yet?
There's I'm kind of interested in some scripted projects. There's a really um, and kind of drawing on my experience in documentary and history storytelling. There are so many stories of our ancestors, so many people who paved the way for people, and I would love to be bringing those stories out. So, looking at a couple of things like that. Um, I'd actually like to do a comedy at some point. Like I do a lot of serious stuff, a lot of politics. Luther was my first music doc, and it was a lot of fun. And I did that. I needed a fun movie. It's sad, that his life ends too early, but otherwise, Luther is joy. Those songs, when people watch this film in the theaters, they sing along, and they leave lighter. They leave remembering like what a gift he was. So, I would like to do something, that's funny. So I'm kind of looking for some kind of comedy. I haven't found that yet.
What type of feedback? What feedback in particular really has stood out to you as it relates to someone uh, after they've seen the film, the Luther Vandross Never Too Much story? Is there anything that stands out? A response from someone who's seen the film?
What I love so much about Luther Vandross and the audience response is there are the super fans who they will come up to you and say, "We know every single thing about Luther," and then they find something that they didn't know, and they see the footage, and then they say, "Ah, we didn't think we could learn anything else. We love that." And then I love the people who are not so familiar with his story, and those people come out singing too, and I think it kind of reflects what Luther was trying to do. Is he really believed good music is good music, and that is not restricted to one race of people. Who everybody can enjoy his music. So I think that has been one of the really gratifying things. The other really gratifying thing about the Luther movie is how many people are going to see it multiple times and bringing their families. So I get a lot of like children bringing their parents or parents bringing their grown children and them going together. A good friend, Eugenia Clark, who's the president of Fisk University, her daughter said, "I have 3 hours with you, Mom." And she said, "All right, let's go see Luther." And they both went and they had a great time. So, finding things that we can do with our grown kids is always a challenge. So I love hearing those stories. And I think we could all use a little joy right now. And I think Luther, a lot of his talent brings people so much joy. I really love um, watching. The audience will clap after some of his performances like they're at a show. And that gives me a lot of joy. Like I'm bringing back Luther's shows to people. Those were such spectacular shows.
Wow, just wow. On the other side of that adulation, how do you handle the negative, not so positive feedback in both your professional and personal life?
I haven't really gotten a lot of negative feedback. um, I think, sometimes you think films are really great and they don't get acknowledged the way you should. So I think like Luther has not gotten, like critical acclaim. I think it's one of the best films I've ever done. And so
Mm,
it's very surprising to me that it's not like in the conversation for, big awards. And,
Mm.
I have theories about that. But I think you've got to kind of, I'm going to leave it to everybody else to theorize who are the critics and who's familiar and who's watching. I'm just going to leave that right there. But I think there's like nothing that can take away my joy from this movie. I know how good it is. I know like the pacing of this movie is so great. His, I'm so proud of the editing. I didn't do the editing. It's an editor I hadn't worked with before. I'm so proud that we were able to come together and work so seamlessly, not really knowing each other. We got to know each other through this movie. So, sometimes you're not going to get recognized when you should. That's why we have the NAACP Image Awards as well, right? Because that is all too familiar a phenomenon for Black art and entertainment. That's just true. Um, so, I think finishing the work is the first thing. That's the most important thing. Finishing it and have the family and close friends be so moved and be so inspired to go out on the road, with me in promotion of the film. And then the audiences, like, those are the things that are like, you'll never forget that. You never forget the people crying and laughing and saying thank you and wanting to talk after screenings. Like, it's been a lot of joy, this ride with this movie.
It's awesome. Just a few more minutes we've got with you, but wanted to ask, as it relates to totally immersing yourself into a project, are there times and are there certain films where it's been heavy, the content perhaps, or the emotionally, uh, what you have to deal with emotionally, that you said, man, this is heavy, and you had to regroup as a result of it?
When you're making films about social and political issues, they often are very, very dark and heavy. I just finished two different projects about wrongfully incarcerated people. And part of my job as the filmmaker is to help the audience experience what it is like to be in prison, for so long. And so, those are just heartbreaking when you see the impact on the families, on the children of people who are incarcerated. Anyone who's incarcerated experiences this loss. It's even more difficult to understand and accept when the person didn't actually commit the crime for which they were sent away for 10, 20, 30 years or more. And so that can get really dark. I think the other thing is seeing people who can't afford bail. Those stories, particularly young people, those really, really would get to me. And in my early days, I would, say, like, I'm going to bail this person out. And you come to realize you cannot do that because you're making the film. That's not your job, but also you can't physically be present everywhere bailing people out. Not to mention I didn't really have the money, but I it just was so
Right.
heartbreaking to see what was happening to people and feeling so helpless to stop it. Um, so, what you got to do then is it is important to take care of yourself. It is important but it is also important to sit with that pain, right?
Mm,
Because
mm.
that's what people are experiencing. And we shouldn't forget that. And we shouldn't forget that we are in positions of not experiencing that kind of pain. And if we can help people get out of that, like, that's what we can contribute. So sometimes you have to sit with the pain, like, because that's what the story demands.
You mentioned you have two sons. What is your conversation like with your two sons as it relates to them growing up in America currently?
I mean, I have the conversation with my sons that every brown mother has with her children. It's not a question of whether we have those conversations, it's when. And so for me, the first conversation with my older child was he was in fifth grade when Trayvon Martin was killed. And that morning, he was asking me questions about it. And he said, "Should I be wearing my hoodie when I walk to school?" And if he had asked me that the day before, I would have said, "Of course, wear your hoodie. Wear whatever you want." And that day, I said, "Listen, you're going to have to be more vigilant than people who are not Black boys." And, and then my husband had the talk about, no mouthing off to the police, put your hands up. The more heartbreaking thing was then I heard him tell his little brother, my younger son, who was in third grade, so he's 8. I heard my 10-year-old tell the 8-year-old, "If any police officer comes up to you, you stay alive till dad and I can get there."
Jeez.
And so the babies are telling each other these stories. And I couldn't interrupt them because he wasn't wrong. That's the hard part, is when you can't answer their fears by saying, "Don't worry about that. You don't need to worry about that," because they do. And that was, way before I knew as much about, and before we all knew as much about how many wrongful deaths have happened by people who should be keeping us safe. So, we've had those conversations quite a bit. The other thing that happened is when I was making some films, sometimes my older son would be with me at work, and he would be doing homework and I'd be watching footage. And I remember the first time he said to me, "Aren't the police supposed to be keeping us safe?" And I had to try and figure out how to I don't want him terrified of police,
Right.
but he also needs to know he's got to be a little wary. So those are hard. But they live in the world, and you have to sometimes suppress your fears for them because I want them to have full lives. Um, but they are quite aware of things. During pandemic, we all went to several marches as a family, and I think that was helpful. It was helpful to see so many people of all backgrounds saying this is wrong. I think that those kinds of demonstrations really do help.
Profound response. Two real quick questions. First one is, are there any stories that you'd like to retell? Any stories that you've seen and you thought, I'd like to get my hands on that. I'd love to retell that story. Is there anything that comes to mind?
Roots.
Roots.
No, I'm not.
Ah.
I'm only kind of kidding because I mean, do you remember like
A little
everybody
bit.
watched Roots every
Yeah.
night? You
Yeah.
know, so I wouldn't. It's not Roots exactly, but like, what could be that
Yeah.
cultural moment where the whole country is talking about something and seeing it in a new way? I'm trying to. I'm like, what's that story? What's our modern day Roots?
Mm,
So it's not redoing it, but what is something that significant that people could all agree is all that significant? So I try and think about stories like that. You know,
got it.
That's-
What do you think documentary films, visual storytelling will play in the future of fighting for a more equitable world?
I really believe that documentary has kind of an irreplaceable part of preserving our history and documenting what's happening at this time. And at a time when the general public is paying less attention to legacy media. And legacy media is doing less and less deep dive investigative reporting. Particularly the long form documentary film, it allows you to slow down and give some context and explanation. I did a 4-part series about the Supreme Court that tells you not just what the decisions are happening today, but tells you how we got to today from 1954 forward. And that's the kind of, information that I think is really important. And then I think just, 50 years from now, I think people are going to have a whole lot of questions. So I hope that we are recording what I'm recording right now. I hope some other documentarian, some little Dawn in the future is like, let me look through her footage and see if I can make sense of what these people were thinking. And all I have to tell her is, I do not have any answers. This is all your story to tell of how we got into this messy place. And I hope the story that they will be able to tell is how we got out of it.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed in the Our Culture, Our Stories podcast are those of the individual hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect the official policies or positions of the NAACP or any affiliated organizations.